Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Recovery Talk. Quick note before we get started with today's topic. My group coaching program from quasi to full recovery begins in just under a week. Of course, depending on when you're listening to this episode. But today, I'm recording this on the Tuesday, the 25th of April, 2023. It is just under a week till we begin. We begin May the 1st, 2023. Last time I checked, I think there were like 3 spots available, so most spots are taken already, but I still have a few last minute spots if anyone is interested in joining. To join, head to my website, contact@letsrecover.co.uk, or send me an email at contact@letsrecover.co.uk to see if there still are spaces available upon listening to this episode. Because by the time you listen to this episode, the spaces may not still be there, or the program may have started. So if you're listening to this and all spots are taken by now, or if you're listening to this after May the 1st, then, and you are interested in joining group coaching programs in the future, you can head to my website, letsrecover.co.uk, and join the coaching waitlist and tick off that you are interested in group coaching. If so, you will be the first one to know whenever I take bookings for the next round of group coaching. I cannot guarantee you there will be a next round of group coaching, but I hope to release something in the future, but it probably will be some time from now because I'm going to be very busy for the next 2 months with the From Quasi to Full Recovery group coaching program and participants there. If you want to know more about the group coaching program, just pop over to my website, letsrecover.co.uk, or you can also listen to the bonus podcast episode that I launched that's specifically about the group coaching program. I am so excited to get started. I just opened the community / support group for the program yesterday, actually. And I'm finally getting to meet some of the participants, and I'm so buzzed. I'm ready to get started. And also a little bit nervous because I put in so much work and it's really been a labor of love. And I just really, really hope people enjoy it and get a lot out of it. That is just my only goal with this program. Anyways, guys, let's start talking about the topic for today, which is food perfectionism. So perfectionism in itself, I have discussed a bit in the past. For example, I have done one episode that is titled Recovery Perfectionism, Doubt and Procrastination. And in that episode, I basically argue that perfectionism in recovery is actually often something that happens in a tool of the eating disorder to postpone recovery or set unrealistic ideals of recovery. Essentially, people think perfectionism is a tool to do something really well, when actually it instead can often be a tool to not do something at all because you set the bar so high that you're kind of doomed to fail. And in general, I argue that, wanting to do recovery well, that's really good. It's good that you want to do recovery well. But what I often see is that perfectionism in recovery becomes about doing recovery a specific way or not doing it at all. So it becomes more a tool of the eating disorder rather than a tool of your healthy self. Because when it comes to perfectionism and recovery is just imperfect. Recovery is supposed to be imperfect, it's supposed to be messy. And please don't get me wrong, this does not mean that I'm rationalizing or justifying engaging in distorted behaviors because, recovery is supposed to be a bit messy, so do a bit of purging and do a bit of restricted behaviors. This is not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that with recovery, you kind of have to take a leap of faith, jump into it, and you maybe don't know exactly what to expect. It may not go exactly how you expected it to go. A lot of times it goes a lot better than people expect. I see this a lot. People have all these worst case scenarios about how they think recovery is going to be, and then they go through it and it's like, oh, this wasn't too bad. Or they have certain things in recovery that they think will be a massive challenge, and that part actually went quite easy. And then there's something else that maybe they thought would be pretty easy and straightforward that ends up being difficult. But anyways, that was a bit about perfectionism in terms of recovery and just recovery perfectionism overall. If you're interested in hearing a bit more about that, then I definitely recommend you check out the episode about recovery perfectionism and procrastination and doubt that I've done previously. And now we're going to talk about food perfectionism and eating disorders, and also food perfectionism and recovery. I'm gonna explain a bit about some common reasons, underlying reasons as to why this happens. And also offer some advice on how to deal with food perfectionism in recovery and beyond. Or hopefully not beyond, because you want your recovered life not to revolve around food and food needing to be perfect. So let me start with a bit of a personal throwback, right? So I remember when I started my recovery 10 years ago. Yeah, Jesus Christ, 10 years ago this year, which is, it's been a long time, right? So I started my recovery, and part of me was quite excited about the food, right? I felt very ashamed for being excited about the food, but I was really excited about the food. And this is actually very normal in people with eating disorders, that they feel very excited about the food, right? You can be kind of scared around something, but also be excited. It is very rare that I see people with eating disorders who just have complete aversion to food and no interest and don't want to engage with it, right? I'm sure that happens, but it is a more rare presentation. Because overall, our undernourished brains are wired towards finding food very, very interesting and rewarding, right? And a lot of times, hunger starts manifesting more as food obsession and constant thoughts around food rather than just physical hunger. It's kind of like the brain is realizing, oh, you're kind of just ignoring the hunger cues I'm sending you, so I'll send you some mental obsession about food and make your entire life and reward system to be around food, looking at pictures of food, cooking, but maybe not even eating it, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, 2013, I'm starting my recovery. I've accepted and come to peace with the fact that, yeah, you know what? I need to eat more, I need to increase my intake, I need to put on some weight, etc., etc. I have made peace with this and kind of just accepted it is what it is. And here I am, presented with all this food, and I was given quite a lot of freedom in terms of what I ate because I did outpatient treatment. And even working with the clinic and working with the dietitian, I was given, some flexibility in terms of what I was eating. I just needed to reach a certain amount. So I was given a lot of freedom and flexibility, but oh my goodness, I took this project very, very seriously. I wanted to create the perfect meal plan, right? I remember doing endless calculations of amounts, of the perfect ratio between the different macronutrients, obsessing about getting all the vitamins. Interesting that I do that, considering my eating disorder would tell me, oh yeah, it's because you care about health, right? But my entire eating disorder proved that I was very actively neglecting my own health, right? But overall, food and eating became this new project that I needed to do perfectly. And if I couldn't do it perfectly, no point. I wouldn't want to embrace the messiness of it. So I was there with my perfect meal plan and getting the perfect amount of everything, extreme food perfectionism. And I didn't quite understand why. Of course, part of me told myself that, oh, it is just because you really care about health. You want to get healthy, right? But as I said a bit earlier, that was not really it when you really dug into the depths of it, because my whole eating disorder was not really a health-promoting behavior. Then eventually, once I dug a bit deeper, and a few things I can see in retrospect is that it was not necessarily about health. It was not about a genuine desire to be healthy, because if that was something that was very, very important to me, I wouldn't have had an eating disorder to begin with, right? What it actually was about, a few things, right? First of all, I had a lot of guilt around food, even though I was excited about it. And I felt that if I just did it really well, if I just did it in a nutritionally perfect way, it would somehow be more justifiable. So in some ways, being really orthorexic in some ways, even though I wasn't necessarily neglecting entire food groups, I was actually quite steady in terms of getting all the foods in, all the food groups in. I wasn't necessarily cutting down on anything, but I was still very much concerned about getting the perfect balance and ratio of things. And overall, being orthorexic in that sense alleviated my guilt for needing food at all, and especially for needing so much food, because I was in a higher calorie intake here. And another thing that I realized that was very much underlying was a food scarcity mindset, right? So I had been restricting myself from food. I've been very restrictive, and now I was finally allowed access to it. But I still had that scarcity mindset in my head. And I felt like, well, the food that I do get, I need to make it super perfect. And food was still just extremely rewarding, and I was quite food obsessed. and therefore was like, yeah, I need to do this perfect for it to be worth it, for it to be justifiable, etc., etc. Now I am the least food perfectionistic person you can imagine. Like, I'll just eat something straight out of the container whilst standing up next to the fridge. I will pop the microwave dinner in the microwave and then just eat it straight out of the plastic container. Like, I just don't really care. Don't get me wrong, I will have times where, for example, maybe I'll cook myself a nice meal or go out to a restaurant and eat something nice that will, look a bit presentable. But overall, I don't really care so much. And I think reason why this is because the food scarcity mindset is gone. I know that food is such an abundant resource that it doesn't need to be perfect to be quote unquote worth it. So perceived scarcity is creating an illusion of value. If you can get something unlimited whenever you want it, it loses some of its appeal. Whilst if you limit something, make it a bit more exclusive, right? Then your attitudes around it will change. Think about it like you will have certain clothes that you only wear in special occasions. And then, of course, these clothes, when you're wearing them, you're like, oh, I'm wearing this special outfit, right? Versus if you just allow yourself to wear something all the time, then it's going to be just another piece of clothing, right? I know that was not a perfect example, but just one that I could randomly think of on the top of my head. And what I also see now is that with food, I know that this one meal is not my one chance to eat. And if I want something more after, I can't have it, right? If I want something more, I'll just go grab it. And that was something I had a very hard time during my eating disorder. If I wanted something else or I wanted something more, it was like, no, I can't have it because that thing on my, meal plan, that was my one chance to eat. And this is one of the unfortunate things with meal plans. Don't get me wrong, meal plans can be very, very helpful tools to ensure you're getting enough. But sometimes what is actually intended to be a minimum and a minimum guideline often becomes a maximum. And then you have a reinforcement of the scarcity mindset. I sometimes call it the calorie budget mindset. And I've done an episode where I talk about this before, titled The Calorie Budget Mindset. Essentially, if you're on a budget, if you have a very tight finances, you're going to be a bit more careful with how you spend your money, right? But if you are generally doing quite okay financially, you're going to be a bit more relaxed about it. But interestingly enough, if you're someone who have previously had a very tight budget and suddenly you are financially abundant, you may notice that some of the behaviors that you had when being very, very frugal and having to save a lot still stick. So it took my brain some time and experience to learn that food is an abundant resource, that I can go and have another portion, right? And that was work that I also had to do when coming off my meal plan, right? Because the meal plan, in my case, it was quite helpful because for me, intuitive eating just didn't take me to a sufficient intake, except for during my extreme hunger phases, which were kind of unpredictable. They kind of would come and go. But such an important job that I was doing was that I had to get out of this mindset that I was only allowed a maximum of 3,000 calories a day, right? That was the maximum range I was allowed. It was actually a recovery minimum for me. So yeah, these were some of my own experiences and reflections. Maybe some of you can relate to this. But overall, what I want to challenge you a bit to investigate is this idea that food perfectionism and recovery and needing it to be, I guess, nutritionally perfect or present perfectly, that this just have to do with health, right? That this is just about health promoting behaviors. Instead, it could be an idea to look into, is this a way for me to alleviate my guilt for needing food in the first place, for needing a higher intake in recovery? And also you might find that just something like preparing your meals, making your meals look really nice, that is something that just gives you a lot of excitement. And I'm not saying that there is anything wrong with feeling excitement and joy around food, but I am saying is if you find that preparing your meals and making them look aesthetically perfect is just the most fun part of your day, there is a high chance that you're actually quite undernourished and your brain is sending you reward signals for any kind of food-related focus and behavior. I remember during my own recovery, and if anyone followed me 10 years ago, they may have known, I was obsessed with making the most aesthetically pleasing meals. So I would make these like oatmeals that were very beautiful. It was like food art, right? And I did it also because I loved doing it. I thought it was so much fun. But then one thing I realized that as I kept going in my recovery, as I put on some necessary weight and as I renourished myself, I lost interest, right? It was not something that I actively had to quote unquote work on. I just noticed that the act of refeeding actually lessened my interest in food and making the food look so goddamn pleasing aesthetically, right? Very quickly, I would rather in the morning be more interested about thinking, okay, what am I going to do today? How am I going to plan? Checking my emails, blah, 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 rather than spending those extra 5 minutes decorating my oatmeal with nuts and chocolate. I would kind of just throw it all together and eat it whilst I was doing other things. And this was because the food obsession actually lessened. Another thing that I see a lot is this thing that for food to be worth it, it must be extremely rewarding, right? I may have spoken a bit about this in the past, but I just want to touch base on it again because I think this also relates to food perfectionism and can be a presentation of it. One thing that I very often hear from clients is that, for example, if they're going to go challenge a fear food, they are very scared that it will be underwhelming, right? Oh, what if I allow myself to eat that chocolate, but then I realize, it was not that good, right? Or if that happens sometimes, people will feel very guilty because like, oh, that was a waste, right? And can you see how this relates to that food scarcity mindset where food must be perfect or very, very rewarding in order to be worth it? And this is such a sneaky one that I think is very often overlooked when it comes to eating disorders, right? Because we always tell people, yeah, go get that food that you want and crave. And yes, you should. But also, it is okay to grab like a random bag of crisps at the train station that maybe was not the exact flavor you wanted and still eat it. And this food perfectionism can also manifest in location or context, right? So I mentioned the train station. This is a very, very good example, right? Where someone is like, yeah, I can allow myself to have a bag of crisps, but it must be in a perfect context. I must be alone. I must be in my room, having my computer, watching something on Netflix. There must be like a nice dim light in the room. It must be that nice crisp that I really craved. It must be in my specific bowl. The context and circumstances must be perfect in order for me to have certain foods and snacks, whilst just grabbing it on the go at the train station and kind of not really enjoying it or tasting it and maybe being on your phone as you're eating that crisps. That for some people can be terrifying. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not telling you that, oh yeah, you should just skip your snack nights. No. Keep the snack nights, right? Keep those snack nights. But also allow yourself to have the food throughout the day and have also food in more imperfect situations. It's okay to make yourself a nice, aesthetically pleasing dinner, but also make sure that you're able to grab something on the go. It's okay to have your little ritualistic little evening snack, but also have that food outside of those snack windows. Have that food imperfectly. And if you go to the store and you really craved Snickers, but they only have Mars bars, still have the Mars bars, right? This does not mean, oh, well, then I won't have it at all, right? Food don't need to be perfect. It does not need to be aesthetically perfect. It does not need to be nutritionally perfect. It does not need to be situationally perfect. And there are going to be times where it is more or less rewarding. But that doesn't mean that it is a so-called waste when it is not perfect or when it's not extremely rewarding. You still need foods. Don't fall into the trap to be like, oh yeah, I will have chocolate, but only if I really desperately crave chocolate. If I don't really, really desperately crave it, I will go for my safe foods, right? Don't fall into that trap. Ironically, by doing so, you still are putting food on a bit of a pedestal, right? Because it becomes this like thing that you only have when it's like under specific terms of conditions, right? And I think this is sad because I sometimes see this reinforced in intuitive eating communities where the underlying messaging sometimes seems to be that intuitive eating is a tool to prevent your eating, quote unquote, too much of certain foods. That if you just hyper focus on your bodily cues enough, you will finally realize that you want the apple and not the chocolate bar, and that you allow certain foods in order to not eventually eat so-called too many of them, right? Can you see how diet culture can creep into intuitive eating spaces? And unfortunately, I sometimes see this in recovery spaces as well. It is so important here to look at food as just a morally neutral thing. And I also like talking about food variety instead of food balance, because balance suggests that there is some like kind of magical scale where you need to balance something out. And equally, you might find that there is very little variety in recovery. You might find that you genuinely just want the chocolate all the time. That is okay. Nevertheless, if you find that you're constantly gravitating towards safe foods and you're concealing that as a preference or genuine craving, it may be worth investigating. During my own recovery, I would always convince myself that, oh, but I just really like, certain foods. I just really like so-called healthy foods, or foods that I perceived as healthy. I remember I would just convince myself that I liked whole grain everything. And then eventually I realized that, there are certain foods that I prefer whole grain. For example, I really like whole grain bread with like chunky seed parts in it. That's something I really like. But then I also realized that when it comes, for example, to pasta, I don't really like whole grain pasta as much as the white grain pasta, and therefore I tend to have the white grain pasta, right? Same thing with rice. I prefer white rice over brown rice, therefore I have the white rice. So investigate your preferences a bit as well and see that it is not this health perfectionism or anorexic mindset that are sneakily behind it. And also, just because you have a certain preference doesn't mean that you can't try the other option, right? For example, yes, I genuinely really like whole grain bread over white bread, but I still will have white bread. I still am completely fine having white bread. I have it quite a lot. And also in certain contexts, I really prefer white bread, especially like pastries and stuff like that. Is whole grain pastries a thing? I really hope it's not a thing. But I actually just was thinking about that. Wow. Imagine. That's a crime against pastries. But yeah, anyways, I say this because a lot of times I will talk to people who are like, yeah, but I just genuinely enjoy insert so-called healthy option. And then it's like, yeah, that's cool. But then they also feel anxiety by the thought of trying something else, because then they feel like, oh, but it's a waste because I don't really enjoy it. It's a waste because I could have had the healthier option, right? Almost like it is some kind of thing where, yeah, you should always try and always choose the healthier option unless you really, really crave something else, then you are allowed, right? Again, can you see the sneaky ways we may put moral value onto food and food choices? So the key takeaways here, I would strongly encourage you to investigate your food perfectionism and what kind of elements you think may be underlying, and then also take some action, right? So when it comes to food perfectionism that's driven by food obsession and just your brain being undernourished and wired towards finding food extremely interesting, you may be like hobby baking bread for your whole neighborhood, or you might be, even thinking of pursuing a nutrition career, right? You just find food so interesting and rewarding. If so, especially if this interest happened during or after a period of starvation or famine, perceived famine, restriction, then it could be worth investigating what this really is about and check that this is not just your brain being in an undernourished state and making it super rewarding, right? Because trust me, you rather know that sooner or later. You don't want to find that out when you're already starting like your baking business and you have a bunch of cupcake orders to finish and you realize, oh my goodness, I'm so tired of baking. This is so boring. I don't find this interesting anymore, because you corrected the energetic deficit. So be curious about your food, obsession of finding it extremely rewarding. Equally, you shouldn't be ashamed of it, right? I don't want you to be like, oh my goodness, I'm so obsessed with food. I shouldn't do this. There's something wrong with me. Actually, you need to correct the energetic deficit, and it kind of will resolve itself if you allow yourself food in abundance. And you need to eat your way out of it, not think your way out of it, right? When it comes to food obsession driven by undernourishment, very specific situation there, that is something that needs to be corrected by correcting the energetic deficit and ending up in not necessarily just energetic balance, but also energetic surplus, especially if you are in recovery. And that is something that tends to kind of resolve itself with proper refeeding. And if it's not resolving itself, take a look at whether or not you are properly refeeding. And then when it comes to the other mindsets that I mentioned, with the perfectionism, the food needing to be a certain way in order to be worth it, this is something that you can practically challenge. So get curious on how these behaviors manifest and on ways for you to challenge it. For example, grab something on the go imperfectly, right? Just grabbing that sandwich from that sandwich shop that doesn't maybe look perfect, but you need something to eat anyways. Grab something on the go, it's okay. And also, be curious to see if the undernourishment is reinforcing a scarcity mindset in your brain, right? If your brain is still detecting that food is a scarce resource, then of course it's going to want the food that you actually do access to be perfect and to be extremely rewarding, extremely fun, extremely aesthetically pleasing, blah, blah, blah. The food perfectionism will creep in. We also know that just a state of undernourishment can increase someone's rigidity. And we often talk about how rigidity and perfectionism are behaviors or personality traits that make someone more prone to develop an eating disorder, or this whole thing with, oh, control, right? I also want to remind you that the state of undernourishment actually heightens and strengthens those traits. So something to be curious about as well. I found that a lot of my just overall perfectionistic behavior, and especially this very rigid, very, black and white thinking kind of behavior, actually got a lot better just by correcting the energetic deficit and restore my weight. Because you do not want to spend like a year in therapy talking about why you're so rigid, only to realize that, oh damn, I needed to eat, right? That's a waste of time and money, isn't it? And unfortunately, I often see that there is a lack of understanding even in the psychological field about the impact of undernourishment on someone's mental health and on someone's behavior and on their cognitive rigidity. Anyways, guys, I think we can conclude that an eating disorder is very, very sneaky. It will creep in sometimes in places you didn't even realize. And sometimes people may wonder, yeah, but it is so subtle anyways. Like, why even bother with targeting those sneaky behaviors? And the answer to that is how an eating disorder thrives, right? Is those sneaky behavior maintain the bigger monster of the eating disorder. And that's why it's so important to target them. Because essentially recovery and being fully recovered and out of that quasi state that so many people are in is about the small things, right? Recovery is about ordering that kebab that maybe didn't look so good, but all the other places were closed and you just need to grab something anyways without panic and guilt. Recovery is about eating whatever you made, even though you burned it a little bit, because who cares, right? Who cares if you burned your pancake a bit? Recovery is about, this chocolate isn't the best thing I tried, but might as well finish it. Recovery is about flexibility, about presence, about, yes, it's okay to enjoy food. Food is lovely, food is great, but not revolving your entire life around what kind of, what kind of grain are you going to have on your salad, right? Or spending your weekends in the grocery shop as the most fun and rewarding thing you can think about, right? That is not really you. That is restriction-driven food obsession and food-seeking behavior triggered by an energetic deficit that you need to correct. Don't confuse yourself with the eating disorder. Don't confuse your true personality with a cognitive reaction to an undernourishment state. Anyways, guys, I'm going to take a listener question. This one is from the Instagram Ask Box. I know I mentioned this at the end of like every episode, but I'm still going to say it again for some new listeners. I take listener questions and also topic requests via Instagram, where I open the Ask Box in my stories at Instagram letsrecover.co.uk or at Instagram Amalie Lee. So keep an eye on my stories there for, the Ask Box that I open with regular intervals. So now I'm going to take a question from there. So this individual is asking, do you need a meal plan in recovery? My answer to that is, it depends. A lot of people who work in the field of eating disorders have very strong opinions when it comes to meal plans. Either that, yes, it is absolutely essential, everyone needs it, or no, you can never use a meal plan, throw the whole thing away. So I like having a bit more of a balanced view on things like that, because again, it depends from the person to person. But what is so important to highlight is that a meal plan in recovery is meant as a temporary tool to ensure you're getting enough food at regular intervals. That's it. If you are someone where eating so-called intuitively is not taking you to eat a sufficient amount of food or eating at sufficient regular intervals, then a meal plan or a rough meal structure may be something to consider. If you are someone experiencing, let's say, reactive hunger, right, where you find that actually by just letting go and eating freely, this take you to a sufficient intake, then it's not really any specific need as to why you should have a meal plan, unless you are in the super early stages of recovery and you need to gradually increase your intake to avoid, to reduce the risk of refeeding syndrome. And if you are, please talk to a medical professional just to discuss on how best to proceed to avoid refeeding syndrome. Refeeding syndrome is essentially a very rare but potentially quite dangerous complication that happen when someone very undernourished increased their intake in early recovery. There actually has been some studies lately that show that increasing super slow doesn't necessarily reduce the risk of refeeding syndrome with that much, that it actually is okay to go a bit more aggressive. But overall, it is so important that you are talking with a medical professional about this and are experiencing medical monitoring as you're increasing your intake in early recovery if you are in the risk group of refeeding syndrome. So yeah, back to the question a little bit. A meal plan can be a helpful tool, temporary tool in recovery to make sure that you're getting enough and getting enough at regular intervals. That's about it. What it is not meant as is a permanent tool. What it can be meant as is a backup tool for certain situations. So for example, someone may be recovered and eating freely and intuitively, but then they experience something in their life, whether it's physical illness or an extreme stressful period, that means that their hunger cues gets switched off a bit. They lose their appetite and they notice that they end up in a bit of an energetic deficit. Then having a meal plan or a rough meal structure as a backup plan to make sure you're getting enough and to engage in some mechanical eating during those times can be helpful and can be something to think about. When I work with clients, we sometimes use meal plans that they have gotten from a dietitian as a tool temporarily in terms of, getting them to a sufficient intake, getting them to restore some weight if that is a necessary part of their process, and then we work on gradually coming off it. Sometimes people prefer going off it a bit more cold turkey, right? And that can really work for people, especially if you are experiencing reactive hunger or even just a increased hunger where you know that going off it will not be restrictive. Other times people may find that it's helpful doing it a bit more gradually. So again, it depends from person to person. And this is a typical thing that could be really good to work with a coach or a therapist with. What I want you to be mindful of is mentally making a meal plan a maximum when it actually is a minimum. And also be mindful of using the meal plan as a justification to excessively count or weigh or measure your food. There is no reason why a meal plan can't be flexible, unless you are someone where it being flexible automatically makes you restrictive. But realistically speaking, most people can be on a meal plan without weighing every single thing they put in their mouth. And if you have a dietitian, this could be something good to discuss with a dietitian. You can maybe see, hey, you know what, I feel like I want a meal plan, but I want it to be quite flexible. So can you maybe give some rough guideline amounts instead of putting in exact calories and exact grams, Or it can even be something, if you have to measure it in deciliter instead of putting it on the food scale, right? Overall, it is a bit of a complex topic because it is quite individual, and it is also a bit more than I can cover just in a listener question. In the group coaching program, I've actually dedicated a whole week just to be about meal plans, moving from meal plan to intuitive eating, quitting calorie counting, etc., etc. So it is something overall that I can't necessarily answer completely comprehensively in a few minutes. But overall, as I mentioned before, whether or not a meal plan is right for you, it really depends on your unique situation. But what is very important is seeing the meal plan as a supplementary tool to ensure you get enough. And if you notice that that's not really what it is about, instead the meal plan become this thing to make sure you're not getting quote unquote too much. No such thing, by the way, but of course your eating disorder will tell you it is. Then it could be worth investigating if this really is for the benefit of your recovery. Okay guys, I hope that answered it at least a little bit, and I hope you enjoyed this episode as well. And yeah, I will see you guys next week with another episode. Next week episode, I have a guest with me where we're discussing family-based treatment and parents of people with eating disorders. So that's going to be very, very exciting. Looking forward to that. And yeah, I will see you guys next week. And I also will probably see some of you in the From Quasi to Full Recovery group coaching program very soon. Super excited about that. Have a good day and week, guys.